Hey there everyone, welcome back to our series on Heidegger's Being and Time. This time we're going to be looking at chapter 3, the first about half of chapter 3. And this chapter is focused on die Weltlichkeit der Welt, the worldliness of the world, or the worldhood of the world. This is concerned with understanding what it means to live in a world and what this phenomenon of world means more specifically. And we are currently in the fourth week of this reading group that we are doing. If you would like to join us, you can follow along with this schedule that you see here. You can join the Zoom that we'll be doing once a week if you'd like to just ask questions and things like that, but by no means is that required, and if you're watching this after it has come out, feel free to follow along with this well-paced schedule if you just like to see what it's like to read some of Heidegger, since we're not going through all of Being and Time. Now he begins by returning to what we mean by world. And he says that worldliness is itself an existential. And when he's speaking of worldliness, he says if we pose the question of world, in quotation marks, which world is meant? Neither this nor that world, but rather the worldliness of world in general. So what he's meaning here is that this is something which we live in. It is some sort of embodied interaction with beings, which, as Heidegger is trying to show, gives us some starting point for understanding the question of being, the Seinsfrage. And he gives us four different definitions of world, kind of expanding on some of the ones previously. First, we have an ontic world. This is something akin to the universe, the sum of all physical parts. It is ontic. He says it signifies the totality of beings which can be objectively present within the world. And that word objectively present there is Vorhandenheit. And we've been discussing that word to some extent throughout, but now in this chapter we're really going to finally flesh out the concepts of Zuhandenheit and Vorhandenheit. These are traditionally, in the Morkorian-Robinson translation, translated as readiness to hand and presence at hand. Those are not the words that are used in this translation. In this Stambau translation, it is handiness and objective presence. And we'll be talking about those words as we get into them, but Zuhandenheit and Vorhandenheit are going to become very important terms here. So then the second idea of world, this is something like a milieu or a discourse or a context. He says here that world functions as an ontological term, and it signifies the being of those beings in one. Indeed, world can name the region which embraces a multiplicity of beings. So the beings that we're now concerned with are not just ontic beings, but also those whose being is ontological, namely Dasein. He says, for example, when we speak of the world of the mathematician, we mean the region of all possible mathematical objects. So you can see here that the objects that concern the mathematician, many of them are abstractions, which themselves are not physical ontic beings. They require a context in order to make sense of them, and indeed words in a mathematical discourse or context, we can see the familiarity of these words, have their own sense within this world. So indeed something's being depends upon being located within a world, and this can change, for example, what something signifies. And then the third concept of world is basically existential location. He says, again, world can be understood in an ontic sense, but not as beings essentially unlike Dasein that can be encountered within the world, but rather as that in which a factical Dasein lives, as Dasein. Here, world has a pre-ontological existential meaning. There are various possibilities here. A world can mean a public world of the we, or one's own and nearest domestic surrounding world. So, right, this is a sort of subjectified understanding of world as something which is of concern to us. But both of these second and third definitions, respectively, are only halves of the cake. And to put them together, we get the fourth definition. This is worldliness. It is an ontological and existential concept. He says worldliness itself can be modified into the respective structural totality of particular worlds, but contains in itself the a priori of worldliness in general. So worldliness is the foundation upon which are built different worlds, but with this phenomenon as the means by which a world reveals itself to one as something which can be lived in. And a good definition of worldliness, because a lot of these words Heidegger gives somewhat definitions, but maybe they're not the most clear. Worldliness, or Weltlichkeit, is an a priori structure, just like being, for example, is a structure, and time is a structure that he'll talk about in Division 2, within which beings are articulated or designated qua beings. And this is an important thing that I wanted to talk about. It's all the way back in the introduction on page 5 of the Stambau translation. He says that being is that which determines beings as beings. That in terms of which beings have always been understood no matter how they are discussed. So, right, we have a pre-ontological understanding of being, and then being determines beings as beings. But, and I'm indebted to a professor friend of mine, Rolf J. Goebel, who pointed out that the German here, bestimmt, means something like to mark, to designate, to articulate. It has a very similar meaning in this context to logos, or to what phenomenon does. It has this revealing aspect, which is able to designate or articulate something as such by revealing it. And Heidegger is trying to show that it reveals itself in its context. So worldliness is that ability for a context or world to become something livable, and livable within and throughout. Now Heidegger elaborates by saying that being in the world, and thus the world as well, must be the subject of our analytic in the horizon of average everydayness, as the nearest kind of being of Dasein. So he's trying to locate the way that we typically live in the world, to show that the sort of abstractions that occur in, for example, Descartes or Husserl, that these are indeed abstractions which do not represent the way we primarily comport ourselves towards the world. He's trying to locate an analytic of Dasein's being, that being its Sein, as absorbed in what Hubert Dreyfus calls skillful coping. Think of a blacksmith or some kind of craftsman. They have skills which they use to cope with the world, and they use tools to do this, and they sort of have a streamlined way of getting through their workshop or through their daily life by using their skills to cope with and therefore comport themselves towards a specific world. And Heidegger says that the closest world of everyday Dasein is the surrounding world, or the Umwelt. This can be seen as something like, again, an ontological context. It is something which surrounds us, but which we are also, of course, within. And he says that the expression surrounding world, Umwelt, contains a reference to spatiality in its component around, The quality of around, herum, which is constitutive for the surrounding world, does not, however, have a primarily spatial meaning. Rather, the spatial character, which uncontestably belongs to a surrounding world, can be clarified only on the basis of the structure of worldliness. Here, the spatiality of Dasein mentioned in section 12 becomes phenomenally visible. This is the existential spatiality which I spoke of on pages 54 through 55. Heidegger is trying to say that the ability for us to have a world which is primarily understood as spatial, this would be something like a physical environment, which is a spatial thing within which one can orient oneself. This is predicated on the ability of a world to open itself up again, to articulate beings within a world by this phenomenon of worldliness. So worldliness is this a priori structure which allows something to be lived within. And this, of course, allows for the abstraction, which he mentions just a few sentences later, of, for example, Descartes' cogito, for thinking of the world as in the mind. This is predicated on the world first being something lived within, which we can then abstract from. In the case of Descartes, for example, when he opens his meditations and he decides that, you know what I'm going to do? I'm just going to lock myself in my room and do these ontological investigations. Heidegger would see this as a telltale sign that Descartes first had to be living within the world and then abstract himself away from it and think of himself as this detached, rational subject that makes representations in the mind, something that Heidegger has continually been critiquing. And he says that the closest kind of dealing is not mere conceptual cognition, erkennen, but rather a handling, using and taking care which has its own kind of knowledge, or Erkenntnis. And this is really important. There is a knowledge which is gained by merely living within and through the world. And as opposed to Descartes or Husserl, it is non-formal and it is non-cognitive knowledge gained through skillful coping, through, I forget what Heidegger calls it, something like handfully dealings, or being absorbed within the world by making an issue out of it. He writes, thus, this phenomenological interpretation is not a cognition of existent qualities of beings, but rather a determination of the structure of their being, right? This is something Heidegger is concerned with throughout. Structures, which is our ontological consideration, rather than just ontic considerations of the qualities of beings and just collating these qualities together. Heidegger has said throughout that you can list off a series of ontic facts about a being, but you're not going to find the ordering principle that tells us why those beings are beings as such. So he says, phenomenologically pre-thematic beings, right? This being before a thematic explicit understanding of them. What is used and produced becomes accessible when we put ourselves in the place of taking care in the world. Strictly speaking, to talk of putting ourselves in the place of taking care is misleading. We do not first need to put ourselves in the place of this way of being and dealing with and taking care. Everyday Dasein always already is in this way. For example, in opening the door, I use the doorknob. So, in using or encountering beings, this is not primarily or primordially on the basis of cognition, which is to say, Husserlian intentionality that I talked about in the last lecture. Rather, we notice how a being can be used, how it can be encountered, how it can be made issue out of, and thereby we make an issue out of, for example, our own Dasein. So what is used or produced is discovered by how it's used or produced via its ability to become part of our dealings, right? So we make an issue out of things, but not by consciously deciding that we are going to take care of the world, right? Which is to say, make an issue out of the world to comport ourselves towards it. No, we simply already are in this mode of being. When I need to enter a room, when I need to open the door, I just open it and I don't think about it. And now one of these really important terms that we've come to here is Zeug. This is translated as tools in the Macquarie and Robinson translation. Here it is translated as useful things. And while tools works a lot better for, using it in English conversation, I think useful things is actually a bit better, because when we think of tools in English, we might think of like a hammer is Heidegger's classic example. But tools can be a lot more. It can be the blinker of a car. It can be a book. It can be, as he says, that with which one has to do in taking care in dealings. They are the beings encountered in taking care. And Zeug, Z-E-U-G, I always thought it was Zug, but it's Zeug. These can be thought of as beings used and available qua Zuhandenheit, which is to say, readiness to hand or handiness, right? They present themselves, a tool does, like a book, for example, as something which I can use, which has a use which is available to me based on knowing a context or a world in which books are just normal, everyday objects that I can use. So this quality of Zuhandenheit, or handiness, allows something to be made ready to hand, right? It is ready for me to use without me having to do anything. And it allows me to encounter my world. And primarily, one of the qualities of Zeug is utility. But Heidegger says that strictly speaking, there is no such thing as a Zeug, or useful thing. There always belongs to the being of a useful thing a totality of useful things in which this useful thing can be what it is. And this totality of useful things, very important term that Heidegger is using. You can think of this as an equipmental whole, right? A whole series of equipment which works together. You can think of it as a nexus, as a functional network, as a discourse, as an assemblage. And those latter two may be a bit of a stretch, but at least conceptually they help us get at the idea of some equipmental context, and within which this could have, secondary tools. So for with a hammer, this could also be nails and a bench on which to operate and wood through which to hammer nails. This could also be the various tools we use. This could be norms and practices. All of these would constitute this totality of useful things. Because, right, norms and practices, too, these are things which present themselves as something which I can just immediately use in my daily life. Even things like stereotypes would qualify here. These are things which are sort of readily there and are ready at hand, ready to hand, for me to use in some way. And he says that useful things, Zeug, always are in terms of their belonging to other useful things. This is a very important statement which we can basically reduce to, you've heard no man is an island, but have you heard no Zeug is an island? Right? No Zeug is self-sufficient on its own. It requires the contextualization of other tools which are used. He says that these things never show themselves initially by themselves, in order then to fill out a room as a sum of real things. What we encounter as closest to us, although we do not grasp it thematically, is the room. Not as what is between the four walls in a geometrical, spatial sense, but rather as something useful for living. On the basis of this, an organizing shows itself, and in this organization, any individual useful thing shows itself. A totality of useful things, right? This is that equipmental whole, that nexus, that functional network, is always already discovered before the individual useful thing. Right? So already, we do not encounter these Zeug primarily or usually as just spatial objects, as just mere things, but rather value and use-laden things in a context which we're already familiar with. Think of, for example, normatives, right, of how you ought to act. These are things which you sort of already know. You grow up alongside them without ever having to necessarily have all of them be explicitly told to you. For example, gender roles. you just kind of get the feeling that, oh, this is how I ought to dress, or this is how, if I dress this way, I will be perceived as being normal. And in line with the idea that Zeug are not just these barren things, he says that the less we just stare at the thing called hammer, the more we take hold of it and use it, the more original our relation to it becomes, and the more undisguisedly it is encountered as what it is, as a useful thing. We shall call the useful thing's kind of being, or mode of being, in which it reveals itself by itself, handiness, Zuhandenheit. So, right, tools are tools precisely because they're not just normal objects, but precisely because they are something which can be used seamlessly for an in order to, right? They can be the path by which we do something in our world, which we couldn't do on our own, and which allows the context within which we live to illuminate itself. And he says no matter how keenly we just look at the outward appearance of things constituted in one way or another, we cannot discover handiness. When we just look at things theoretically, we lack an understanding of handiness. Our dealings with useful things are subordinate to the manifold of references of the in order to. So, right, this is important. We have a whole list of, I'm doing this task in order to ... in order to ... It's a list of priorities which come together to combine with our world within which we live to allow us to comport ourselves towards a world at all, right? Jordan Peterson kind of does this in a faux way of having a value hierarchy of, oh, if I want to do something that requires that I value it, and in order to value that, it requires I value something more primordial, and Jordan Peterson says that just this final value is God, which is weird, but it is kind of going to work for this insofar as when I make use of this book, when I apprehend it in its handiness, not by just looking at it as, oh, it's just this series of pages, which is itself made of trees, which is stuck together by a spine. No, when I use it by reading it and just being absorbed in it, I am valuing it in a certain way, and I'm valuing certain things about my being, which become at issue when I use this object. And when I do that, when I just read it, we get something very special. He says, what is peculiar to what is initially at hand is that it withdraws, so to speak, in its character of handiness in order to be really handy. What everyday dealings are initially busy with is not tools themselves, but the work. Right, so when I'm trying to learn by using this book and I'm reading from it, the book itself recedes into the background, so to speak. It withdraws from my explicit concern. And I'm now concerned with, what do these words mean? What are the concepts that I'm thinking about? The work, which is the in order to, that is, being articulated through the reading of this book, that becomes what is primary. Such that when a tool is in its proper use, when its handiness is understood authentically, they recede, and the task at hand is now that in which the tool is only encountered obliquely, right? The tool just happens to be there. And it's important that it's there. I wouldn't be able to read the words without the book. But nevertheless, existentially speaking, it's only obliquely there as a sort of side remark, which is a condition of possibility for this existential phenomenon of, for example, thinking about die Seinsfrage, about the question of being, about figuring out the meaning of my existence on an existential level. Now, this world that Heidegger is talking about is not just, like we said, an ontic world, something like nature. It is not mere objective presence, or Vorhandenheit. This is, again, we've talked about Zuhandenheit, or handiness. Now we're talking about Vorhandenheit, or objective presence. This is just something which is an object, which you can't make use of at all. It just sits there. It doesn't present itself as being value-laden necessarily. It just is. And it's not handy or anything. And he mentions that this world that we're thinking about, it's not an abstraction, the likes of which a natural scientist would do, where he turns things that may be value-laden into just Vorhandenheit, objectively present. Heidegger says, the botanist's plants are not the flowers of the hedgerow. The river's source ascertained by the geographer is not the source in the ground. Right? These are very different ways of thinking about the world, as something which we are absorbed in, or as something which we abstract from and make maybe some of the value come out in order for us to get a more objective understanding of it. But of course, in this objective understanding, we turn it into an object. He says that here the world is encountered in which wearers and users live. A world which is at the same time our world. Right, so nature is of course a determining factor of the world, be that the urban world, the business world, the craftsman's world, the blacksmith's world. You have to have actual objects there, of course. And he says that the surrounding world of nature is also at hand in the usage of clock equipment, which is at first inconspicuously at hand. Our absorption in taking care of things in the work world nearest to us has the function of discovering. Right? So for example, when I use tools, it requires that in a slight sense, I am finding the handiness of the world. In the case of like clocks, they rely on certain astronomical phenomena, such that they are indirectly now taken at issue, such that we discover the Umwelt, the surrounding world, by tacitly referring to it, when we're presupposing it and problematizing the world. And then we're thereby, making it an object of concern via Zeug. Now moving into section 16, this is starting on page 72 of the Stambau translation, stuff starts to ramp up quite a bit. He now starts talking about, okay, what is the mode in which, when I'm using tools, I am oriented towards the world? He calls this heedful absorption. He calls this heedful dealings. Again, Dreyfus calls this skillful coping. All of these are very useful terms. And this thus illuminates the world, the place in which we live, which is, of course, as Heidegger has mentioned, not just spatial. But there are a couple of different ways in which tools can be illuminated or revealed as Unzuhandenheit, unhandy. Now the first of these is conspicuousness. This is Auffallen or Auffälligkeit. This is when a tool malfunctions. He says this presence of what is unusable still does not lack all handiness whatsoever. The useful thing thus present is still not a thing which just occurs somewhere. But in this case, something has broken down in the tool such that it still presents itself as a tool, but just a tool which is unhandy, which is broken in some way, and not just a bare object, albeit now it is in need of repair. So, of course, the common example is when you have a hammer and it's the wrong weight, or the metal bit on the top of the hammer flies off when you're using it, or the wooden handle breaks. This would be an example of conspicuousness. And of course, what happens here in Auffälligkeit, inconspicuousness, is the tool does reveal itself in a way it hadn't before, such that now the tool becomes something which we're just like looking at as something which is a bit more of an object than it was before. As Heidegger has said, when we're using the tool and understanding its handiness authentically through using it, it recedes into the background, right? But it becomes explicit when in the mode of Auffälligkeit, of conspicuousness. So for example, if I'm just holding this book and the spine suddenly breaks or something, and the pages just start falling out. That happened with my copy of Deleuze and Guattari's A Thousand Plateaus, and it was really annoying. When that happens, suddenly I actually have to start thinking about the objective qualities, that being an object of this book, and I start thinking about, well, yeah, it is a series of pages bound by this thing we call a spine, and now I have to fix it some way. Now I have to use hot glue, and I have to use, a hot iron and all this different stuff to try to get it back to where I can use it in its handiness, in its Zuhandenheit. So with conspicuousness, there is something good about it in the sense that it makes the being of this thing, which had previously receded, conspicuous. Now there's a second kind, which is called obtrusiveness, or der Aufdringlichkeit. And this would be total breakdown. He says it reveals itself as something merely present, which cannot be budged without the missing element. This missing element would be something like, for example, in the case of a hammer, you're missing the nails that the hammer is supposed to hammer into. And you're like, well, now this is literally just a hammer. This is a total breakdown of the system where I am stuck in a rut, where this hammer does not do what it's supposed to do, and it's not just a matter of fixing it, it's literally there is something missing, which is not only not at hand, but it's literally physically not here. It's not something I can make an issue out of by seeing it in its conspicuousness, and it just becomes explicit, and now I can, fix it like I did with the book. No, it's not there at all. So in Aufdringlichkeit, we have a total breakdown of the system that we had before, and we have to actually go out and very explicitly look for something specific and find it, and now we might start thinking about, what kind of nails do I need? Maybe I wasn't thinking about that when I just had the nails here and I was using them, or maybe I was given the nails and I never even had to go get them in the first place. And then, of course, we have a third kind, which is a sort of a temporary breakdown. When something gets in the way, it's no longer, for example, maybe I'm trying to get out of bed, and I've got the book in my lap. And I try to get out of the bed, and I forget that the book is in my lap. And suddenly I feel this weight on me. And my task of getting out of bed becomes more difficult. In that situation, the book has now become obstinate, or Aussäßlichkeit. In this case, it now shows itself as a disturbance, something which gets in the way. So it, of course, requires me to open my mind to the context of, what is the task I'm trying to do? I'm trying to get out of bed. What's in my way? This book. What do I need to do? Move the book out of the way. So we can see that this is a little bit more of a temporary breakdown, where there is very much something I can do right now. It's not like I have to go and find something that's literally not there at all. So I'm able to make issue of something that's here, but it's just that what was previously a useful tool may now present itself as something obstinate, something which is not budging. And these three modes, once again, are conspicuousness, obtrusiveness, and obstinacy. Auffälligkeit, Aufdringlichkeit, and Aussäßlichkeit. Now, Hubert Dreyfus, in his Being in the World, a really great guide for understanding being in time, very, very detailed when it comes to understanding phenomenology and Husserl. He's a Husserl scholar in addition to a Heidegger scholar. Dreyfus basically summarizes what Heidegger says regarding how does this change the way we interact with the world when Zeug become unhandlich, when they become unready to hand, when they become unhandy. He says that what was previously transparent becomes explicitly manifest. Deprived of access to what we normally count on, we act deliberately, paying attention to what we are doing. So right, there's sort of an icing on the cake here, where sure stuff is kind of out of whack, but it does help us through confronting problems to understand our world more deeply. And Heidegger mentions two different things that are concerned with how we orient tools in a given moment. There is an in order to and a what for. This what for in the McQuarrie and Robinson translation is called the towards this, and that can create some issues when it comes to comparing translations, and especially, for example, Dreyfus's guide. He's going to talk about the towards this because he's going off of the McQuarrie and Robinson translation. But an in order to is the purpose or the function of the tool. And of course, that in order to depends on the context in which it is. Sometimes a book its in order to is to be read. Sometimes maybe it's a paperweight. Sometimes maybe it's a projectile which can be thrown, right? It depends on the context and all these different things. And then the what for is the goal which is to be attained via the tool's use, right? So the in order to is the more direct, I use the tool in order to read. But then the what for is a bit more existential, it's a bit wider, and we sort of get this receding back of wider and wider senses of value, of ways that we're going to take issue with the world. And Heidegger says, but in a disruption of reference, in being unusable for ... the reference becomes explicit. It does not yet become explicit as an ontological structure, but ontically for our circumspection, which gets annoyed by the damaged tool. It makes the what for visible. The context of useful things is lit up, not as a totality never seen before, but as a totality that has continually been seen beforehand in our circumspection. But with this totality, world makes itself known. Right? So when these tools break down, suddenly the world kind of lights up in a problematic way it hadn't before. Before, we were just engaged in, again, what Heidegger calls heedful absorption, or heedful dealings, or as Dreyfus calls it, skillful coping. But all of a sudden now, the world lights up. The context in which we use this thing now lights up as something which is an explicit concern for me. And he speaks of the context of references, the Verweisungszusammenhang. And this is a very important term that is going to spawn the idea of discourse, of assemblage, of milieu in French theory. Foucault himself admitted that he was intensely influenced by Heidegger. Verweisungs is referral, and then Zusammenhänge is to be connected, to be together, to interlink, to cohere, right? I think to interlink is one of these meanings that I find particularly useful. And of course, context of reference is the best translation of Verweisungszusammenhänge. But nevertheless, these additional meanings are important, of an interlinking context of things which refer to each other. With regards to reference, Dreyfus in Being in the World, this is on page 92, he says that hammers make sense by referring to nails, etc. But how does the activity of hammering make sense? Right? Which is to say, it's something that just appears to us as, oh yeah, that's how you do things. Equipment makes sense only in the context of other equipment. Our use of equipment, Zeug, right? Equipment, tools, useful things, basically all the same thing, makes sense because our activity has a point, right? A purpose or some sense of value that drives it forward. Thus, besides the in order to that assigns equipment to an equipmental whole, already discussed, the use of equipment exhibits a wherein, or practical context, a with which, or item of equipment, right? When I'm doing the act of hammering, I am doing it with the hammer. And then it has a towards which again, this is one of those terms that I said is translated a bit differently. This is what for in the Standbau, but it's towards this, or towards which is the goal. and a for the sake of which, or a final point. To take a specific example, I write on the blackboard in the classroom with a piece of chalk in order to draw a chart as a step towards explaining Heidegger for the sake of my being a good teacher. So that's a good kind of example of thinking about how did these totality of references, this Verweisungszusammenhänge, how does this all mix together? Dreyfus says, human beings relate to the world in an organized, purposive manner without the constant accompaniment of representational states that specify what the action is aimed at accomplishing. According to Heidegger, to explain everyday transparent coping, we do not need to introduce a mental representation of a goal at all. Activity can be purposive without the actor having in mind a purpose. Right? So we just exist in this context of things that we don't even have to make explicit, but we can literally just be absorbed in. It naturally is going to give us values which we didn't have to decide upon. Importantly, Heidegger states here on page 75, world is always already predisclosed for circumspect heedfulness, together with the accessibility of inner-worldly beings at hand. Thus, world is something in which, worin, Dasein as a being already always was. And world is that to which Dasein can always only come back whenever it explicitly moves toward something in some way. Right? We were already in a world of things which we were familiar with, and which, for example, is able to be lit up when something becomes unhandy. He says, being in the world signifies the unthematic, circumspect absorption in the references constituted for the handiness of the totality of Zeug, or useful things. And he says that this requires that we have some familiarity with the world. Indeed, considering that Weltlichkeit, worldliness, is a structure, just like being, this is why Heidegger is so concerned with phenomenological hermeneutical analysis. Because it requires some familiarity with something that was pre-phenomenologically there. Although, it was not there thematically, pre-phenomenologically, right? This is in the introduction, how Heidegger is escaping the hermeneutic circle. Because these practices, for example, these norms, these ways or standards of using Zeug, those aren't there as something that we just know explicitly and thematically already, right? The blacksmith just uses the tools. Even when he's learning how to use tools, he very quickly becomes accustomed to these practices and will invent his own practices that he didn't consciously think of. He just thinks, oh yeah, I actually found that if I raise my swing an inch higher, I actually get a little bit more throw, but it's not too much that it breaks the board that I'm nailing into, things like this, which are not thematic, but require a pre-ontological understanding or familiarity with the world, and specifically with a referential totality, or Verweisungsganzheit. In Dreyfus and McCrory and Robinson, this is non-thematic circumspective absorption, is this familiarity with the world, right? So it's non-thematic insofar as it's not some kind of explicit rational representation. It's circumspective because, right, we circumspect the world when we're trying to figure out how can we make use of it, and then we're just absorbed in the world. Now, there's a very special type of Zeug that Heidegger wants to point out, which is signs. And signs are, I remember reading this the first time, maybe like 2 years ago. Man, I spent like days on like these 3 pages because it was just way over my head at the time. This is where it does really help to have this Dreyfus guide, which I'll be reading quite a bit from here. Dreyfus defines signs as functioning entities whose function is to show their practical context. In Being and Time, Heidegger uses the example of a car blinker. right? So you turn your blinker on and it alerts other people not only to the state of the car, but to the state of the context around the car, of the rest of traffic that's going on. Heidegger is trying to say, as Dreyfus says, signs always function against a practical background that they presuppose into which they direct our attention. Dreyfus continues, this is on page 101 of the Being in the World Guide. Heidegger's point is that to cope with such signs is to cope not just with them, but with the whole interconnected pattern of activity into which they are integrated. And integrated is important because that's a non-thematic, non-explicit, non-cognitive way of things already having, a way of being in the world. He says, if they are to function as signs for us, we certainly cannot just stare at them in the same way we can't just stare at Zeug. And we cannot use them in isolation. That's important. He quotes here from Heidegger, this is in page 79 of the German. The sign is not authentically grasped if we just stare at it and identify it as an indicator thing which occurs. Dreyfus continues, moreover, the sign does not simply point to other objects current in the situation. For example, the street or the direction the car will take. It lights up the situation itself. Right? So in the case of a blinker, maybe I've got some sort of a four-way stop, and the blinker tells the other cars in what order they should yield to the practical context, that is, blank amount of cars at this intersection, the intersection of which is defined as a four-way stop, and such. Dreyfus says, thus signs point out the context of shared practical activity, i.e. the world. Right? So in the same way that Zeug allow for the world to light up when they're broken, signs, when they're working properly, do this. He says that they cannot be understood as a mere relation of one thing to another. And this is Heidegger's implicit critique of semiotics. Of course, because with semiotics, they're trying to understand signs from an abstract, detached point of view. But Heidegger is trying to show that, in a sense, we can't really get behind signs. In order to understand signs, and indeed the world, there's something we're already familiar with to an extent. Dreyfus says, signs can do their job only because we already know our way about in the world. A sign's signifying must take place in a context, and it signifies, i.e. can be a sign only for those who dwell in that context. Right? So we have to actually dwell in this world in order for signs to make sense at all. Heidegger says, the sign applies to the circumspection of heedful dealings in such a way that the circumspection which follows its direction brings the aroundness of the surrounding world in every instance into an explicit overview in that compliance. Circumspect overseeing does not comprehend what is at hand. Instead, it acquires an orientation within the surrounding world. Right? So signs reveal a context of shared practical activity that doesn't make us comprehend the world in an explicit way, in like a propositional way. No, signs allow for us to have an orientation within the world. In the case of the urban world of traffic, they allow us to orient the way that we're driving in this particular situation by having some additional information, which points us to the context of, all the time you'll be driving, and because someone has their blinker on, you realize that, the car in front of them is trying to turn. That's why we're stopped in the middle of the road. This car behind them has their blinker on to let me know. So in that situation, the state of the car in front of me and in front of the car which is in front of me now become explicit. Heidegger further states, signs are not things which stand in an indicating relationship to another thing. Rather, they are useful things, Zeug, which explicitly bring a totality of useful things to circumspection, so that the worldly character of what is at hand makes itself known at the same time. Right? So the world becomes something that I make an issue out of at the same time that it is being revealed through signs. You can think of this in addition with like a road sign, right? That tells you something explicit about, oh, not only is this just a list of physical things, of buildings, but also it's something which is named, which means that people are living here. It's something that people think about and they orient their lives towards when they're trying to drive to this street, for example. So, right, in this way, world opens itself up. And he says that signs always indicate primarily wherein we live, what our heedfulness is concerned with, what relevance it has. And this wherein we live, of course, is the world. To close this section on signs, here on page 81, he gives us somewhat of a definition, the clearest definition we'll get of signs. He says, in their handiness, right, in their Zuhandenheit, the surrounding world becomes explicitly accessible to circumspection. A sign is something ontically at hand, which, as this definite useful thing, Zeug, functions at the same time as something which indicates the ontological structure of handiness, referential totality, and worldliness. Right? So signs are very important. If we think about, how difficult would it be to get around in a city which has no street signs? And not only that, but no traffic lights, and no cars with brake lights or blinkers or anything like that. It'd be very confusing, because especially in these complex systems, such as the urban world, you need lots of signs to help make sense of all these disparate practices and collect them together into such a referential totality that we can actually understand and make sense of. Because especially in big cities, these referential totalities are so big that if we don't have signs, it doesn't become explicit for us enough to actually get through the world. Now, in a bit of a return to this hermeneutic circle question that he was talking about in the introduction, he says that world is already there in all things at hand. World is already discovered beforehand, together with everything encountered, although not thematically. Right? World is something which we're tacitly engaged with, but without already understanding it to its fullest extent as some sort of all-encompassing proposition. And when he says world is already discovered, he puts a little footnote, which is not a footnote that is included in like the McCrory and Robinson translation. These are subsequent endnotes which he has added, oftentimes very comically, just saying incorrect to his own stuff. And when he says that world is already discovered, he says cleared, or gelichtet. And of course, this gelichtet is closely related to the word Lichtung, which Heidegger uses to talk about being. He says that being is a clearing, a Lichtung, which is to say that it is like being in a forest and then you enter a clearing where suddenly the world illuminates itself to you as something lived within, as something value-laden, as something beautiful, indeed. So when world is discovered, it is cleared, gelichtet. So I think it's just important to keep that little bit in mind, because especially if you go later into being in time, you're going to see that idea of being as a Lichtung come back in, and I think it's important to note that. But he says, world is that in terms of which things at hand are at hand for us. And he continues, but as the constitution of useful things, serviceability, in parentheses reference, is also not the suitability of beings, but the condition of the possibility of being for their being able to be determined by suitability. Very dense right there, but it's actually not that complicated if we just distill it down from Heidegger's language a little bit, right? He has a lot of these nested clauses, which are like 3 different kind of subjects. But the usefulness of a tool is not an in itself, like an objective quality, like this book is hard or it is such and such dimensions wide. Rather, it is determined by the surrounding conditions of suitability. And once again, the word for determined is bestimmt, which means to designate, to articulate, to mark something as indeed having such and such reference, in accordance with this referential totality. So things are not inherently useful, right? Because to be useful means to be useful for or to some situation. This is useful for reading, but it may not be useful for firewood necessarily. I mean, you might get something out of it, but I imagine paper burns pretty quick, unlike firewood, right? So it is determined by its suitability, which is context dependent. And they are always relevant together with something else. That's important. So to be handy, or Zuhandenheit, qua Zeug, is to be located together with an equipmental context. He says, which relevance things at hand have is prefigured in terms of the total relevance. This, a totality of reference. This is very similar to Verweisungszusammenhänge. He says the total reference, which, for example, constitutes the things at hand in a workshop in their handiness, is earlier than any single useful thing. So a tool's relevance to a task is predicated upon an already existent, an already present totality of priorities, of usefulnesses, of for the sakes of which allow me to even make an issue out of a tool. And he says that the primary what for is a for the sake of which, but the for the sake of which always concerns the being of Dasein, which is essentially concerned about this being itself and its being. This for the sake of which is the purpose or the vocation of Dasein when it is using Zeug. So this is an existential. This for the sake of which is, for example, to be a good dad, to be a professor, to be a productive member of society. This is the for the sake of which. And this is the sort of highest value that Heidegger sees structuring the way we make an issue out of the world. This is our existentiality in its deepest sense, right? Because this relates to, for example, the way we think about our own existence, the way we think about death. All of these define our for the sake of which. On page 84, Heidegger writes, when a being shows itself in general to heedfulness, that is, when a being is discovered in its being, its Sein, it is always already a thing at hand in the surrounding world in precisely not initially merely present world stuff. This is really important. To realize or to take heed of something which is handy, it's not just to attach a previously just objectively present thing, a task, a value, a purpose. Rather, we realize that such values, purposes, tasks, those were already there. They were already something that had to have been such that we can make an issue out of it by using them. He continues, as the being of things at hand, relevance itself is always discovered only on the basis of a totality of reference, a Bewandtnisganzheit, previously discovered, that is, in the things at hand encountered. What we call the worldly character of things at hand thus lies pre-discovered. And Bewandtnis means purpose or reason, or in this case, relevance, right? So we have a totality of relevance which defines in what sense is such a tool relevant to my for the sake of which is to say my vocation or my purpose for being in the world. And thus we seek, when using tools, to free them for a totality of relevance, right? To free them for being used seamlessly in a task. He says, in understanding a context of relations, Dasein has been referred to and in order to in terms of an explicitly or inexplicitly grasped potentiality for being, sein können, for the sake of which it is, which can be authentic or inauthentic. Right? So this potentiality for being that is grasped, this sein können, this is Dasein's vocation or its purpose. This is something which it can either authentically grasp as, yes, this is something that I need to orient myself towards, or it's something I can kind of try to deny and say, no, this is not what I'm meant to do. And of course, the hairy part of Heidegger for me sometimes is figuring out the difference between that authenticity and inauthenticity on an existential level. But he continues by giving us this very, very detailed page. On page 85, so many definitions are required. I spent forever collating a list together of all the different definitions of these terms, which I will put on screen here for you in a moment so that you can see them and hopefully have an easier time than I did trying to consult the different translations, because of course the Stambau translation uses different translations for some of these words. Both of them are kind of good, the Macquarie-Robinson and the Stambau, but it makes it difficult when consulting different guides of various kinds. But he says, that within which Dasein understands itself beforehand in the mode of self-reference is that for which it lets beings be encountered beforehand. As that for which one lets beings be encountered in the kind of being of relevance, the worin, of self-referential understanding is the phenomenon of world. And the structure of that to which Dasein is referred is what constitutes die Weltlichkeit der Welt, the worldliness of the world. And this for which that he speaks of is worauf hin, a very important and kind of contested term when it comes to translating Heidegger. I just wanted to mention it. I'm not very qualified to talk about the German in specifics, but I can tell you that within which Dasein understands itself beforehand in the mode of self-reference is that for which it lets beings be encountered. This is worauf hin. And we get this paragraph where he's been talking about this worin, the worauf hin, the wherein, or worin, and he finally gets down to basically summing up what amounts to this value hierarchy that I spoke of. This series of relevance which orients the way that we take issue with tools. He says, the for the sake of which signifies an in order to. The in order to signifies a what for. The what for signifies a what in, of letting something be relevant, and the latter a what with of relevance. Gosh, it's so much, and we'll get to all these terms in a moment. These relations are interlocked among themselves as a primordial totality. They are what they are as this signifying in which Dasein gives itself to understand its being in the world beforehand. We shall call this relational totality of signification significance, Bedeutsamkeit. This can also mean like meaningfulness. It is what constitutes the structure of the world, of that in which Dasein as such always already is. So lots of terms there, which we need to have some sort of headway in, which is why I have my trusty German copy, and I've got a list for talking about these different terms. So first, we have worum willen, which is for the sake of which. This is, like I've talked about before, Dasein's vocation or its purpose as a grasped potentiality for being, sein können, via a tool being used. right? So we use tools to make an issue out of our being and thereby the world, and thereby being itself, or sein, and this is for the sake of which, or worum willen. Next we have zu, which points to dazu. This is in order to, which points to what for. This is the immediate goal of using a tool through our heedful dealings, or our concernful coping, or skillful coping. And then we have wobei, which is what in. This is the equipmental whole, or the nexus, or the network, or the context, or the manifold of references, or the referential totality, right? It's this context which was already there pre-ontologically, which allows us to make sense of tools in the first place. So many words there for what you could call that. I just wanted to give you several options so that it might help conceptually. And then finally, you have womit, which is what with. This is the tool used. The womit, when I'm using the hammer, is the actual tool by which I'm doing all these different things. And I had mentioned all of this as a series of values, but that is somewhat inaccurate, because values to an extent they transcend beyond individual cases. They have a sort of higher standard to themselves, but these can be better understood as goals. William Blattner's guide to being in time is much more succinct than Dreyfus's. It doesn't go into as much detail, but there's, in my opinion, better examples when it comes to thinking about how this, what this means in the world. And starting on page 59, he says, circumspection is guided by the totality of assignments that contextualize the task on which we are working. Because I am trying to build a shelf, and because I am able to do so, I refer myself from the task to the equipment and materials. My circumspection is guided by the in order to relations that define the equipment and material and their relation to the task at hand. Circumspection is guided by the practical structure of the workshop. A practical structure that I typically already understand. This practical structure is the wobei, or the what in. Circumspection not only guides me in my immediate activity of building the shelf, but more widely, I also move through the environment and pass from one activity to the next. Why do I build a shelf? In order to set up my garage to hold more of that ineliminable American junk we acquire. So the larger project of making over my garage refers me to the more immediate project of building a shelf, which refers me first to the task of cutting this board down to 8 feet. In all of this, I am guided by the structure of in orders to, that bind the workshop and my activity together. Right? So these in orders to and all of these different senses of relevance, they blend the world with my immediate activity. He says, for example, the hammer points to driving in nails, and driving in nails points to the hammer. Driving nails points to fastening objects, which points to building a shelf, which points in the end to being a homeowner, or carpenter, or construction worker, or what have you. All of the relations Heidegger has been analyzing, for the sake of which, in order to, the whereof, of material construction, and so on, make up the structure of the context in which we operate, which is the structure of the world. And he continues, this is here on page 62 and 63, the workshop is not just a relational system of functions, but rather a fabric of roles held together and grounded in the human possibilities that it subserves. Hammers, nails, and boards make no sense apart from carpentry and home ownership and all the other human possibilities, or for the sakes of which, in which they are involved. The same holds in reverse. There is no such thing as being a carpenter apart from the tools and tasks of the carpenter. Right? So these things are equiprimordial with each other, like I've said before. He continues, these worlds make sense to you in terms of the various facets of your life, your being, your sein. Moreover, the various facets of your being make sense in terms of these worlds. Right? So there's a complementarity here such that you cannot separate Dasein in its being in the ontological sense from the world that it is absorbed in. And this is really important. This is on page 63 of this Blattner guide. The world is a horizon for understanding, a space of possibilities on the background of which we understand both paraphernalia and ourselves. The roles in which paraphernalia are constitutively involved cannot be disentangled from the human possibilities in which we invest ourselves and thereby come to understand who we are. The world is a unitary horizon for making sense of both human life and the paraphernalia with which we surround ourselves. This implies, finally, that we are the sorts of entity who are only insofar as we go about our business in the world in which we live. And very significant here is that idea of a unitary horizon between human life and the world and its paraphernalia. This goes back to that idea of univocity of being, of equiprimordiality that I spoke of in my last lecture. These cannot be separated on an ontological level. And that is how Heidegger here is further adding to this trumping of idealism, that we cannot effectively talk of Dasein as a subject if we mean the Cartesian or Husserlian idea of intentionality, of representationalism. Heidegger states very importantly here on page 85 and 86, as such, Dasein always means that a context of things at hand is already essentially discovered with its being. In that it is, Dasein has always already referred itself to an encounter with a world. So we can see the importance here as a central part of Heidegger's univocity of being sort of ontology, the idea of world. That being said, I hope this has been helpful in terms of making sense of this very dense part of Heidegger's being in time. In the next lecture, we will continue the rest of chapter 3, and in the last lecture after that, we will do all of chapter 4. That being said, check out any of my other lectures I've done on Heidegger, as well as postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and other literature. Become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a monthly private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. I also have super thanks available if you want to donate to the channel, because books are not cheap. That's it for this lecture, and I'll see you in another one.